Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating paradox. We live in a world where the principles of a successful nation are largely known and documented, yet so many nations still inexplicably fail. Why is that? Today, we're going to unpack the fundamental mechanics of government, power, and the unseen systems that dictate whether an entire society thrives or collapses. I want you to really think about this for a second. What is the actual function of government? Beyond the politics and the endless daily news cycle, what is your government truly supposed to be doing on a foundational, operational level? It's so easy to get distracted by the noise, but if we treat a nation like an organization, the answer becomes incredibly clear, and it really sets the stage for everything else we're about to explore. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the purpose of government, then inclusive versus extractive institutions. Number 3 is greed and creative destruction, followed by the authoritarian growth paradox, the resource curse, and finally, the illusion of revolution. I promise you, by the end of this, the way you look at global success and failure is going to be completely transformed. Let's get into it.
All right, Section 1, the purpose of government. Before we can figure out why a society fails, we've got to recognize that every group of people, whether it's a small startup team or an entire society, needs a baseline structure just to function at all. And there's a really clear distinction here between two critical roles. You've got the leader, think a president or a prime minister. Their job is to be the model. They set the sweeping vision, the cultural tone, and the ultimate path for success. But then, right next to that visionary role, you have the manager. And honestly, this is what the government actually is. It's a managing body. Its main function isn't necessarily to dream big. Its function is practical execution. It coordinates public services, which we call administration, and it provides the absolute baseline security of life, property, and contracts, which we call law and order. Without the leader, there's no common goal. But without the manager, the whole system is just disorganized chaos.
So what exactly is that government managing towards? Sure, every country has to produce or sell something to earn a living, whether that's agriculture, mining, or services. But a country isn't just some giant corporate entity defined solely by its GDP. A genuinely successful nation is defined by how it supports the development of every single individual. It upholds justice, it actively supports personal growth, and it provides a high quality of life. That is the ultimate metric of success.
Moving on to Section 2, inclusive versus extractive institutions. If a nation's goal is a high quality of life, the secret sauce isn't really about picking a specific economic path. It's entirely about the institutions set up along that path. On the inclusive side of things, politically, these are democratic, sufficiently centralized, and pluralistic. Economically, they create this incredibly level playing field where everybody gets to use their talents to their absolute full potential. It's uplifting, it's a system built purely on opportunity. But when we look at the extractive side, things get quite a bit darker. Extractive institutions are undemocratic. Politically, the balance is completely shifted into oppressive centralization or just pluralistic chaos. And economically, it's a system based entirely on raw power and elite connections, where only specific individuals are allowed to do what they want. It's literally designed to extract wealth from the many just to benefit the few. And this brings us to a really crucial absolute rule. Opposite institutions simply cannot coexist. Extractive political systems will inevitably give rise to extractive economies. And conversely, inclusive political systems breed inclusive economies. You just can't mix and match these fundamentally opposing forces and expect any sort of long-term stability.
Which brings us to Section 3, greed and creative destruction.
Now, you might be wondering, if inclusive systems clearly work so much better for the population, why do nations still fail? Why on earth would anyone choose the extractive path? Well, it fundamentally boils down to human greed, ambition, and a deep, deep fear of change. See, inclusive institutions are the only ones that actually provide the fair incentives needed to spark technological innovation. People aren't going to innovate if their hard work and rewards are just going to be stolen. But here's the catch. That very innovation triggers what is known as creative destruction. It's the process where new technology dismantles old systems, causing a massive redistribution of political power and wealth. Basically, to move forward, the old way of doing things has to be destroyed. And because of that destruction, progress inevitably creates losers who will fight tooth and nail against it. A dictator is going to fiercely oppose pluralism because they stand to lose an absolute fortune in extracted wealth. The established elites, they'll block progress because they're terrified that the resulting political instability might topple their cozy status. But it's not just the powerful people at the top.
An everyday craftsman might fight against a new inclusive economy out of the very real, absolutely terrifying fear of losing their livelihood to a new machine. Literally everyone, from the highest ruler to the everyday worker, might actually fight against inclusive innovations just to protect their own standing. Let's dive into Section 4, the authoritarian growth paradox.
So if inclusive institutions are required for advancement, how do we explain the crazy, undeniable technological and economic growth of deeply extractive authoritarian nations? Well, it happens through a very specific, almost mechanical sequence. First, an extractive regime heavily centralizes power. Second, they enforce strict discipline, usually using the military. Third, they ruthlessly funnel massive amounts of resources and labor into a very specific sector. This absolutely generates explosive, undeniable short-term growth using existing technologies. But then, step 4 hits. They hit a hard innovation ceiling. Because extractive systems lack the true incentives for ground-up innovation, they always run out of steam eventually. This is exactly the economic trajectory we saw happen with the Soviet Union.
It's super important to understand that all institutions exist on a spectrum. Rarely is anything 100% extractive or inclusive. The source material gives us two really interesting objective data points to look at here. On one hand, China represents a deeply complex mix. Its government provides security, administration, and plenty of opportunities, making it partially inclusive. Yet it operates under strict extractive control. On the flip side, a country like the USA has foundational inclusive systems, but those systems are arguably limited by a massive, growing wealth disparity. That disparity severely restricts genuine economic inclusivity for a vast majority of its people. Neither is absolute. Both just sit at completely different points on this institutional spectrum. All right, Section 5, the resource curse. This builds into one of the most surprising and honestly devastating economic traps on the planet. You'd probably think that discovering massive reserves of gold or oil would be an absolute blessing for a country, right? Actually, it's often a curse. Just contrast these two realities. In resource-rich nations, the rulers can easily control the singular source of earning. They don't need a highly educated populace to dig oil out of the ground. They just need raw labor. And tragically, this often leads to forced extraction and miserable living conditions. We see this in places like Venezuela and Sudan. But ironically, in resource-poor nations, rulers don't have anything in the ground to dig up. They are literally forced to invest in their human resources, like education, innovation, and skills, which naturally results in much better, more inclusive living conditions for the general population. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the illusion of revolution. We all know the standard basics of trying to bring about change: protests, petitions, lobbying. But when things get truly dire, societies often turn to unpeaceful methods. But here is a really hard truth. A revolution changes the leader, not the institutions. If a revolutionary group rallies behind a leader whose only true vision is to gain a seat of power, rather than painstakingly building inclusive institutions, the aftermath is entirely predictable. Once the dust settles, the new system usually ends up being exactly the same or sometimes even worse than the one they just overthrew. This is perfectly captured by vanguardism theory. An elite, disciplined revolutionary party, the vanguard, is incredibly effective. They inject ideology, they organize the workers, and they build this unstoppable momentum to actually execute the revolution. But here is the tragic irony. Because that vanguard is highly centralized and elite, when the revolution is over, they often simply step right in and take over the governance. The power stays concentrated in a small elite, trapping the nation right back into the exact same extractive, authoritarian system they just fought against. Which leaves us with this final, vital thought. Changing the face on the currency or just swapping out the name of the president means absolutely nothing if the underlying mechanics of the country remain extractive. If you want true success, you have to look way beyond the leaders. You have to demand true systemic transformation. So I leave you with this. If you ever find yourself demanding change, are you really just asking for a new manager, or are you truly demanding inclusive political and economic institutions? Thanks so much for exploring this explainer with me today.